Hello and welcome back again. We are coming towards the end of AI for Management course, and today I'm going to sort of consolidate different um, issues that we discussed, particularly on responsible AI through the last few sessions, and we will consolidate and see how um, uh, methods or approaches have been developed by different stakeholders to address the concerns related to AI. So, one is the problem side or the issues side, the other is how you address those issues. And we also closely examine collectively when you look at these problems, what is the nature of the issues and why it needs sort of approach as in developing a set of principles and creating frameworks for governance, and beyond that, requirement for regulation. Okay, so we will also see conceptually how these approaches are framed, what is the thought process behind creating this principles for governance, and also further leading to regulation. And if we have to look at these different mechanisms, as sometimes it is called, to address issues related to AI development and implementation, then we need to take a holistic approach, okay, instead of piecemeal approach. Okay. We may fix one or two issues using smart algorithms, but that's not the end of it. Okay. So, there are much more issues which need to be addressed using sound administrative methods. Okay. And what we discussed today is not technical but more administrative approaches to creating responsible AI, and that is where the role of management and governance come in. Okay. So, this is I would say this is core management principles, governance principles, and regulation. Okay. So, pertaining to AI, and keeping in mind that AI is not a developed technology, it is still an emergent technology, in the sense it is in the laboratories. Okay. So, machines are learning to perform better. Machines are learning to overcome the negative effects, and machines are actually doing more work, or they are actually generalizing more. So, it is actually in this context that we are discussing regulation and governance, etc. So, let's keep that aspect in mind. Okay. So, they say innovation and regulation, these are two polar opposites, in the sense if you regulate too much, then there is no innovation. For example, if Indian government says nothing at the cost of citizens' privacy, okay, no data should be used, private data of individuals should be used for training AI systems, then there is no AI development, because AI stops there if there is no data, and data cannot be used for training algorithms. And therefore, so there is some compromise, there is some trade-off which is required between those conflicting issues. Okay. So therefore, that is where the role of an agent, a separate agent, who actually understand the stakeholders involved and is able to sort of give solutions cutting across different interests comes into picture. So, let us take that view as to what actually these terms really mean, principles, governance and regulation, before we get into the developments in that in this particular area of AI. Okay. So, what we are discussing is actually a multi-stakeholder problem. Okay. Responsible AI is a multi-stakeholder issue. Why it is so? Who is the stakeholder? Okay. In management literature, we will find that a stakeholder is anyone with an interest in a system or a business. Okay. A customer is a stakeholder, a producer is a stakeholder, a middleman is a stakeholder. Okay, so therefore we have to understand stakeholders, and when stakeholders interests are aligned, okay, business functions smoothly. Okay, but when their interests are actually not aligned, okay, then you have a problem. So those aligning those interests, or alignment is not the word that will be used here, it is rather balancing. Okay, reaching some sort of equilibrium by balancing different stakeholder interest becomes critically important when in a given issue there are multiple stakeholders and apparently their interests are in conflict with each other. Okay, so look at an issue like AI. Okay, the AI problem is multi-stakeholder. Look at the interest of Google when Google makes investment in AI. Okay, investment both financially and also in human resources and number of other areas where Google sees AI as a future technology it wants to develop and monetize. Okay, there is a key economic interest for Google in the development of AI. Okay, and therefore Google says internally, do not talk negatively about AI. Okay, it is the business interest of AI. Okay, so now look at the society as a stakeholder. Okay, we have already seen AI can have negative impact on society, for example on sustainability, okay, and on on global warming, etc. Okay, so this goes against the interest of the human society. Okay, so therefore developing AI is one interest, not developing AI the way it is now is another interest, and it is in conflict with each other. Okay, what do we do? Shall we stop AI development because it will adversely affect the environment, or shall we just let AI grow because it's very innovative and useful technology, forgetting about the environment? Both are not right. Okay, so therefore there is a need for balance. Okay, so hence we come to the heart of the problem. How do we resolve this multi-stakeholder conflicting interest? Okay, what are the mechanisms or methods that are available? Okay, so it's like machines. Okay, so you need mechanisms to balance machines. There's a fulcrum that actually balance a lever. In a similar way, you need mechanisms to balance multiple stakeholders. Okay, so what are some of the approaches for resolving multi-stakeholder problems? Okay, number one is the formation of principles and directives. Okay, so looking at the nature of the problem, it is important that stakeholders actually come together, understand the nature of the problem, and in the interest of the whole, or in the interest of the what do you call the ecosystem, the different stakeholders together, develop principles that will actually lead to sustainable growth of the technology. Okay, so that is what is known as principles, or a principle should not be just in favor of one stakeholder alone, but it should actually protect the interest of multiple stakeholders, and therefore you will see that generally it is principles. So there will be a number of principles to guide the development of any system or technology that involves multiple stakeholders. For example, since as a teacher of information privacy, I have seen US government in 1968, when technology, particularly databases, were increasingly collecting and storing citizens' personal data. US government actually constituted a committee to examine potential privacy issues, and the committee came out with a set of principles known as Fair Information Practice Principles. Fair Information Practice Principles, or FIP. Okay, and FIP is one of the well documented principles to protect information privacy of individuals. Okay, so it's a set of principles, and you can't call this governance, you can't call it regulation, but it is just a set of principles. Okay, and another level to which principles can go at a much higher level is the directive. Okay, so governments or agencies can have certain directives. Okay, directives are more powerful than principles, in the sense they are supposed to be followed by people, by the stakeholders. Okay, an example is the data protection directive in the EU, which started in 1995 and was prevalent, to the best of my recall, 2018. Okay, 2018 the directive became something else. Okay, the directive became a regulation. We will see it later. Okay, so principles and directives operate at in creating the principles that will protect the interest of stakeholders, and also give a strong message to the stakeholders to follow those norms or those principles, so that the system as a whole can actually grow or function. Okay, the next topic is governance. Okay, governance involves an entity, of course. Okay, it's not just actually giving the 10 commandments or a set of principles, but the principles need to be operated within a community, within an entity. Say for example, best example is an organization, a company like say Google or Microsoft, okay, or Infosys or Indian Bank. Okay, so any entity which actually develops or use AI needs to have a governance framework for governing AI according to a given set of principles. Okay, here again the principles that you adopt form the core of governance. Okay, what are the principles that are guiding governance? Okay, and how do you actually sequence it, how do you actually monitor it, and how you actually control it? Okay, so that is what becomes a framework. Okay, a framework is the next level which is useful for implementing the principle. It's in a entity or in a organization. Okay, that's what governance is. So at the core, governance consists of a set of principles, okay, which is guiding the governance of a organization from a top level. Okay, so in other words, governance is a mechanism to balance stakeholder interests within an organization or entity. An example is governance risk compliance framework for managing cyber risk, okay, in the context of organizations. So there are different frameworks available if you learn the topic of cyber security management. Okay, so that is the purview of governance. And third is regulation. Okay, regulation is the next level. Okay, so we start with principles and then comes framework for actually implementing the principles. Sorry, the governance and governance frameworks come for sort of implementing those principles in the context of an organization. And third is regulation. Okay, as soon as you hear the term regulation, it needs to be understood differently, because so far, be it principles, be it governance framework, there is no law involved. Okay, there is no legal enforcement. Okay, but when it comes to regulation, regulation is legal. Okay, it is actually constituted by a government. Okay, and that government has powers to legally enforce the regulatory principles. Okay, a regulation will also draw upon fundamental principles. Okay, and they will also refer to those principles, but it is not just a set of nice principles, but it is actually a law. So for example, GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, the R is regulation. Look at DPD, which was constituted by EU from 1995. It was only a directive, but a directive became regulation later on in 2018, if my recall is correct. Okay, so that is in the European Union. So a regulation then becomes a law for all the participating countries or constituents of EU. Okay, look at the DPDP, Data Protection, Digital Personal Data Protection Act of India. Okay, DPDP. So this is also a regulation. Okay, a regulation in the sense the Parliament passed this act, and the act is a law. Okay, and therefore it has all the powers of law. If somebody violates the Data Protection Act, then the one who actually is affected, the affected party, can actually seek legal redressal. Okay, so therefore regulation has legal implication. Okay, so principles, governance, and regulation, these are the three aspects or three mechanisms to actually manage or to sort of address multi-stakeholder issues. Okay, so when we enter into the AI and responsible AI, we see that all these are operating. Okay, and we may get sometimes confused what is what. Okay, so that's why I want to start with this broad introduction, and let me also elaborate the mechanisms from a different perspective. In order to address the problem of non-converging or conflicting interest of multiple stakeholders, as I said, there are mechanisms that exist. Okay, we start with a set of principles. Okay, so there are different types of mechanisms as we have seen. Another way to look at these mechanisms is to see whether they are market based or non-market based mechanisms. Okay, market versus non-market mechanisms. Okay. Look at an issue like global warming or the emissions. Okay, so which has implications for the earth. Okay, so all inhabitants of earth are getting affected by increasing emissions or increasing industrialization and its after effect. Okay, so you can see both market mechanisms and non-market mechanisms being used to address this issue of emissions. Okay, the market mechanism is the industry self-regulation, where the stakeholders within the industry actually come together and largely form mechanisms which are based on economic incentives. Okay, of punishment and reward, you can say, for complying with the principles that will protect the planet. Okay, so emission trading, okay, or carbon market, for example, is an example of a market based mechanism to address the issue of emissions. Okay, so there are industries, or there are firms which emit less carbon versus there are firms which emit more carbon, or so they can actually trade the carbon emission using a common currency or a common value mechanism, and that is purely a market mechanism. Okay, so based on the principle of reward and punishment or economic incentives, and this is an example of industry regulating itself or a self-regulation. But when it comes to non-market mechanisms, it is outside of the market. Okay, a whistleblower, not a whistleblower, a country, for example, in the interest of its citizens. Okay, a larger agency or a big brother not in the negative sense as in George Orwell, but in the positive sense, actually comes into picture to protect the interest of the stakeholders and form certain principles which are enforceable. A good example is the United Nations, which has framed the sustainability development goals. Okay, this is not a market mechanism, but this is something that UN as a body is promoting and trying to enforce in member countries. Okay, so this is not based on economic incentives, but it is actually a set of, I won't say it regulation, but a set of principles that are being promoted and enforced in a way that those who follow it actually will benefit from better image or better reputation for itself, etc. So this is not market based, but it is more regulatory in nature. Any regulation is a non-market mechanism. Okay. Now, the second mechanism is value or classification of mechanism is value based versus market oriented regulation. So, within regulation, a regulation can be guided by different goals. Okay, look at privacy regulation in the United States versus privacy regulation in Europe. Okay, a close examination of the privacy regulation would show that Europe or European Union in particular follows a human value based regulation. Basically, the goal is to the priority is to ensure that human values and freedom are protected in the member country. So that importance is placed first. Whereas if you look at the United States, which is a capitalist country, they place priority on the economy. Okay, so no regulation should lead to the collapse of the economy or collapse of innovation, wherein, you know, if economy collapses, there is it again affects human existence. So, you know, the priority is different. It wants to protect the industry, at the same time ensuring that privacy is also protected. So the orientation in framing regulations can be guided by different principles in priority. Okay, that is the second aspect one should be aware of. Okay, this is going to this can be figured, or this can be easily identified when you look at AI regulation that would be framed in the United States versus Europe. Okay, a value-based, human value-based Europe versus a market-based America is already evident in regulations of digital technologies. Okay, and that is why you can see digital technologies and platforms are thriving in the United States, because there is more openness for sharing of data and innovation in the United States. Okay, of course you can imagine that they don't place as much importance in privacy, accountability, etc. Okay, but this is again in an emergent state, and I am not concluding or I am not making a value judgment, but what is visible in terms of priority is quite obvious. Okay, and the third way of looking at the mechanisms for the balancing stakeholder interest is multi-stakeholder versus multilateral governance. Okay, well, this can be seen as a method of governance using different principles, but the fundamental question is which is the body. Okay, what is the nature of the body that is actually framing this set of principles or governance framework. Okay, it could be a country, it could be a group of countries. Okay, a group of countries like the European Union, a group of member countries like the OECD. These are all called the governance framework created by this kind of coalition of countries is known as multilateral governance mechanism. Multilaterals, when multiple countries actually come together as a group or as a union and then frames frameworks or form frameworks for addressing certain issues that is global in nature. It is called multilateral governance. Multi-stakeholder governance is different. It's not a group of countries, but it's a group of stakeholders, okay, who actually come together and address an emergent issue. Okay, so multi-stakeholder is usually bottom up. Okay, in the sense they look at the problem. The importance is given to the problem, and then actually they come up with the principles and frameworks to address the problem. Okay, a good example is the ICANN, which is for internet governance, a multi-stakeholder entity. ICANN is a multi-stakeholder entity. It's not a group of nations. Okay, it's a group of stakeholders. ITU, International Telecommunication Union, is actually a multilateral entity, that is a group of countries which frames laws and regulations for telecommunications. Okay, so ICANN, there is a tension for internet governance now between ICANN and ITU. See, an advantage ITU or any multilateral body will have over the multi-stakeholder entities is the legal advantage. Okay, international legal advantage, because a multilateral, because it consists of multiple countries, will have more legal standing and smoothness in implementing its frameworks as compared to a group of stakeholders. Okay, but this is for argument's sake. We still have to wait and see how technology companies or multiple stakeholders coming together in the form of industries may have much more power than countries perhaps in future. Okay, so it is still evolving. So to summarize, when we look at responsible AI or the phenomenon of responsible AI and examine the principles and governance frameworks and regulations, etc., we must be also aware of these underlying mechanisms which are actually generating these rules, and that will actually give an indication of how much power they have, how much influence they have, and what is the scope of those principles or regulation, whether it binds to a particular industry or it's just an organization, or it's a set of nice principles, or it's a country, whether it's a group of countries, etc. Okay, that understanding is important in interpreting the RAI or responsible AI principles that are still evolving.